Henry Wallace was FDR's vice president during his third term, and had it not been for the machinations of business and corrupt Democratic Party leadership, may have very well been the 33rd president of the United States. Henry Wallace came from a long line of educated Midwestern Republican farmers. In school, Wallace studied genetics and pioneered major advances in agribusiness and scientific farming, and introduced the system of econometrics to the field of agriculture. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt appointed possibly the most progressive cabinet in American history. Known as the New Dealers, they consisted of radical liberals like Labor Secretary Frances Perkins, the first woman to be appointed to a cabinet post. But it was Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace whose star shined brightest. Roosevelt tasked Wallace with restoring America's heartland, which had been devastated by Mother Nature and the Great Depression. The FDR administration instituted big government policies such as a minimum wage, Social Security, a series of business and banking regulations, stimulus spending, and a public works program that, among other things, brought electricity to rural America and built the Hoover Dam. However, it was Wallace's policies that were most controversial. He ordered the slaughter of 6 million hogs, the destruction of 25% of the South's cotton fields, and paid farmers to leave portions of their land fallow. Despite the initial trepidation, Wallace's plan was a massive success. Cotton doubled as food prices stabilized, and the economy began to grow as farmers all across the country became his most ardent supporters. In 1939, with fascism on the rise and the specter of war looming, Roosevelt made an unprecedented decision to seek a third presidential term. He chose Henry Wallace, America's most vehement anti-fascist, as his vice president. Wallace had an immense range of appeal, rallying feminists, Southern Democrats, Northern Republicans, the emerging civil rights movement, scientists, socialists, city union members, and of course, farmers all across the country. But the Democratic Party bosses like Edwin Pauley, Robert Hannigan, Thomas Pendergast, and James Burns, who represented the reactionary wing of the party, told FDR they would not accept the ultra-liberal Wallace. In retaliation, Roosevelt refused the nomination and said he would not run without Wallace, essentially handing the presidency to the Republicans. The party bosses reluctantly conceded and allowed Wallace to run on the ticket. As vice president, Henry Wallace announced what he called the Declaration of Interdependence, saying, "The ungoverned push of rugged individualism perhaps had an economic justification in the days when we had all the West to surge upon and conquer, but this country has filled up now and grown up. We must blaze new trails in the direction of a controlled economy, common sense, and social decency." However, during the next election, the bosses would not yield. They knew, with Roosevelt's health fading, they would not just be electing the next vice president, but the next president as well. A Gallup poll on July 20th, 1944, showed 65% of Democrats wanted Henry Wallace as vice president, and only 2% wanted a little-known senator from Missouri named Harry Truman. But an event, later referred to as Pauley's coup, was put into motion. During the 1944 Democratic Convention in Chicago, Wallace was the overwhelming favorite, and just as he was about to receive the nomination, the gathering was deemed a fire hazard. The Chicago police forced everyone to evacuate, and the vote was rescheduled for the next day. When the convention resumed, the fix was in, and Truman made a curious jump from 2% to securing the nomination. The next day, Senator Samuel Jackson told Wallace supporter Claude Pepper, "I had strict instructions from Hennigan not to let the convention nominate the vice president last night." Much like George McGovern in 1972 and Bernie Sanders in 2016, Wallace's ambitions were sabotaged by the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. Truman made Wallace Secretary of Commerce, where he fought against the president trying to continue the implementation of New Deal policies. By 1946, the party bosses had had enough of Henry Wallace, and he was dismissed from the cabinet. He then went on to establish the Progressive Party and ran for president in 1948 with a platform that included universal health care, desegregation, and ending the Cold War. The Democrats and the press smeared Wallace, accusing him and the party of being a communist front. However, When he did not welcome or denounce the Communist Party's endorsement of him, Wallace lost the support of both the capitalist Democrats and the Norman Thomas Socialists. Wallace ended up with 2.4% of the popular vote and no electoral votes. Wallace returned to his pursuits in agricultural science, where he made a number of advances. He later openly approved of the U.S. war effort in the Koreas, which drew the ire of his last ally, the far left. In 1952, after the horrors of the Soviet Union were revealed to the world, Wallace stated he was now an anti-communist and would even go on to support Richard Nixon in the 1960s presidential race. In the 1950s, the U.S. was riding high thanks to the policies of Henry Wallace, and few noticed as he was cast into historical obscurity by the thriving America he had helped to create. One can only wonder how the course of American history would have been different had Henry Wallace succeeded Roosevelt instead of Truman and his Wall Street backers. Orville Freeman wrote of Henry Wallace, "History cannot ignore him, and we shall not forget him. No single individual has contributed more to the abundance we enjoy today than Henry Wallace." Thanks for watching.